Welcome back to History 1302. Today we are going to begin our lecture on the Great Depression. Let's go over our objectives. First, we're going to explain the underlying causes of the Depression, and we are going to evaluate President Hoover's attempts to deal with the rapidly declining economy. Then we will be describing the experiences of both urban and rural parts of the United States during the Depression, and we are going to explain the ways in which the Depression affected American politics and the lives of the American people. We are also going to evaluate FDR's actions as designed to alleviate the effects of the Depression and discuss the opposition that he faced. All right, and then lastly, we're going to discuss the most significant long-term effects of the Great Depression. We'll talk about the different New Deal programs and the opposition to these programs as well. Okay. All right. So let's begin with where a lot of people believe that the Great Depression began, and that's with the stock market crash that took place on October 29th, 1929. So the first thing I want to mention about the stock market crash is that it does not cause the Great Depression. Okay. It is a symbol, a representation that the American economy was in a tailspin and just totally out of control. But the stock market crashing on its own does not cause the Great Depression, okay? The Depression is actually caused by these long-term things that have been happening for a while, which we're going to discuss in a minute. And I want to make it clear that if it had just been the stock market crashing, then when the stock market comes back, then the Depression is over, right? It's not that simple, right? It's a very complex, far-reaching event that is going to affect the lives of not just people in the United States, but across the world. It's a worldwide economic collapse. It doesn't just happen here in the United States. That's another thing that I want to, talk about. Okay, so let's talk about, let's briefly mention what's going on with the stock market. So essentially, the stock market had grown a lot during the 20s, in part because of deregulation of, bank practices and lending practices and things like that. A lot of people had been borrowing money to invest in the stock market as, the American economy continued to grow and thrive and do really well. Remember, we're talking about the roaring 20s, right? But what's going to happen by the time we get to 1929 is there's a lot of nervous energy among investors, among, stockbrokers, among the banks, and it's going to be reflected in how on that Monday, the stocks start to drop. Okay. So the way that the stock market works is it grows as more people, investors, put their money into the stock market, right? As more people are investing, investor confidence goes up and more people want to put their money in there because the perception is that this is a time to buy, right? And if you buy into the stock market, if you buy into this companies, if you're investing in them, then you are confident that they are going to do well and you are going to be rewarded with dividends and returns, right? Profits. And so during the 20s, right, we see the stock market go up. But then in 1929, like I said, there's a lot of fears that, this bubble is going to crash. And so on that Monday, before Black Tuesday, right, the day before, this is when investors start to pull their money out of the stock market. Okay. And so what does that mean? That means that they are withdrawing their money that they have invested, right? Because they're no longer confident, because they are fearful that if they leave their money in there, it's going to get lost, right? They're going to lose that investment. They're going to lose any profits. And so they rather cut their losses now than write it out. Okay. And when this happens, that's where you start to see a decline, right? Where you start to see the stock market shrink, and it just snowballs. Lots of more people are going to try to take their money out of the stock market. Again, the fears grow, which means that more investors want to take their money out of the stock market. The companies that are in there are going to be valued less than they were, the previous month or even the previous year. And what's incredible about this is how quickly it all goes down. I think even in our, recent years, we've seen, what could happen when investors become nervous, things that are happening politically or around the world, or when there's a terrorist attack or something like that. Investors get spooked, right? And what do? They start to take their money out of the stock market, and you see, those Dow Jones, the index is going down. One of the things that I recommend that you do, if you don't already have this little widget on your phone, is to go ahead and put it on there, so that you can keep track of what's going on in the stock market. We are, half of a percentage point down for the day. But if you can, open that up, you can track how it's a roller coaster, right, of a ride with the stock market. But you can go 1 month, 1 week, 1 day, 1 week, 5 years, whatever you want, to look at how it's been going, right? And so the 5-year trend is that from 2016 to 2020, the stock market has been growing, right? Looks good, except for that little dip. When did this happen? I don't know. Huge dip, right? I mean, a lot. I think all of the gains that, the United States had made, the economy anyways, in the stock market had made in the previous 4 years were lost in a matter of days. So I invite you to, crack that open and take a look at it. Anyways, stock market stuff, very, very complicated. This is not an economics class, right? But you got to have some kind of a grasp on why this is such a far-reaching event, right? It's going to impact almost everybody, even those that are not investors in the stock market. Because ask yourself, like, how many people do you know that are invested in the stock market, right? Maybe you know a lot, maybe you don't know any. Maybe you yourself are invested, maybe you're not, maybe you've never considered it. But if this were just about the stock market, then only the investors would have been affected by it. And the fact of the matter is that it's lots of countries that are affected by this, lots of people in the United States. It's a worldwide thing, right? Very far reaching. And like I said, it's very difficult to explain in lay terms to people that are not even invested in the stock market, but they've put their money in the bank, that their money's gone. In a single day, people lost their entire life savings. And that's a difficult thing to explain when there's no protection for these investors, when it doesn't appear that they knew, what was at stake. And again, once we get to the end of this chapter, we'll be talking about, how they fix that to build, rebuild consumer confidence in the banks, in the financial institutions, in capitalism, and in the government. Okay, this is why the way that FDR comes in and is just kind of like radical in his approach to dealing with this economic crisis is because he needs to build back trust in the government, in the banks, and the institutions, and our whole way of living in the United States, right? There's a lot at stake, obviously, but we're going to get into that pretty soon, okay? So, people who were invested in the stock market lose everything. People who had money in the banks lose everything, their entire life savings. Everything is gone. It's not just about the stock market. There's these long-term causes for the crash, and we're going to discuss that next, okay? So, there are five major long-term causes of the Great Depression. Long-term, right? Remember, this is happening over time. Yes, the stock market crashed on October 29th, 1929, but that is not what causes it, right? It might be like a catalyst, it might be like a spark, right? But it doesn't, that's not the reason why all of these things happen, okay? The first one is because of instability of the world economy. What this means is that a lot of the nations that we traded with had not fully recovered after World War One, right? So we're talking about the Asian markets, we're talking about the French, the English, the Germans, um, all of these, foreign economies are, the countries are trying to rebuild, they're trying to rebuild their own economies, trying to rebuild, their structure, their society, their cities, and they depend on American goods, right? To do their rebuilding. Um, Everybody is experiencing an economic downturn after the end of World War One. And the truth is that, they just don't bounce back. Our trading partners are not bouncing back as quickly as we would have wanted them to. And so if they're suffering, if they're struggling to get things going again, it affects the United States economy because, again, we depend on them for trade, right? And they depend on us as well. But if their economy is not doing well, then they can't buy things from us. And if they can't buy things from us, well, then our economy is going to hurt too. So that's one reason, what's one of the long-term causes for the Great Depression. Remember, we're trying to look at this from, you know, a faraway perspective. We're trying to analyze, like, what is happening here? Because at the end of the day, we are trying to solve this economic crisis by dealing with the problems, right? And so we cannot simply fix a stock market or fix one problem and not the other, right? That's why it's so hard to get out of the depression in the first place, because it's all of these different problems stacked together. Okay. So, reason number two, the long depression in agriculture. Now, what I mean by this is after World War One, there wasn't that much demand for American goods, right? During the war, there was a lot of price fixing going on, like where the government, remember, we mobilized an entire economy and people and American businesses and stuff like that for the war effort, right? To feed our allies and to feed our troops and stuff like that. And so there was these price um, measures that were put into place where we were basically telling the farmers and everybody we needed to produce, we needed to increase manufacturing and production, and we are going to set these prices here so that you can fulfill the need, right? Whether it's for the United States or for our friends abroad or our allies, whatever. So when the war is over, the price fixing is removed, okay? And when price fixing is removed, right, and you have all of this overproduction, right, because they are constantly producing at a higher rate than they were before. So you remove the price fixing, what happens then? Prices are going to tank, right, because you have oversupply, supply and demand, right? So price is determined by supply and demand. And so if you have an oversupply of whatever goods, what's going to happen to the price? Or if you have an oversupply, is because you probably don't have that much demand for it, right? So what happens to prices? They fall. On the opposite side of that, if supply is down, there isn't enough to go around for everybody. So what happens to demand? Demand goes up, and so does prices, right? Think of when ever there's like a frost or like a freeze in Florida, right? What do we care about what happens in Florida? Well, because it usually has an effect on the price of things like orange juice. Um, Oranges freeze, and they it stops the growth, it stops the production. So guess what? There's not going to be enough orange juice for everybody. Demand is going to continue to go up. Prices go up. Or like a couple years ago when again something happened with the wine production. Um, Not enough wine to go around, demand goes up, so do prices, right? So the same thing is happening here after World War One. The demand is no longer there because we're not at war anymore. So we don't need manufacturing companies to produce as much. And where it hurts the most, and first, before anywhere else in the country, is the American farmers, right? Because farmers in the rural parts of the United States, farmers had essentially, you know, ramped up agricultural production um, to meet with the demands of the war, right? And they did whatever they had to do to meet that demand, whether it's hiring more people, buying more land, taking out loans, buying more equipment like tractors and combines and stuff like that. And then when the war ended, the demand is gone, the price fixing, that guarantee is gone, and they are stuck with all of this food. So I've always said that the people that feel the effects of the depression long before anybody else does is the American farmer. So as early as like 1929 is when the depression starts to hit them. And it's huge, that, and then the migration of the bull weevil, decline of purchasing power, all of those things are going to make things really, really tough for the American farmer. So overproduction and all of that. Okay. Which leads me to my third point. Speaking of overproduction, this is like all around the board problem, right? Overproduction and the decline of purchasing power is a third long-term reason for the Great Depression. What's happening here? Well, it's very closely related to what's happening with the farmers, right? But in this case, it's like every other company. Companies have to produce too much during the war. The war is over, the demand is gone, and then they can't sell all of these things that they've overproduced. So what happens? This causes the prices to drop because demand is down. And you have to figure this out as a business owner. What are you going to do if you have like too much of a product, right? You see this at stores all the time. It's like the clearance aisle, right? You either start to cut prices, and if that doesn't work, then you have to cut costs, right? And that could mean laying off employees or cutting hours or cutting wages. Um, and as a result of that, right, when we see the demand going down and when you see overproduction, companies have to adjust. And so they start to cut prices, they start to cut costs, they start to lay people off or cutting wages or cutting hours, right? So the result of that is a reduction in or a decline in purchasing power, right? So what does that mean for the average American worker? If you work for a company, right? Let's say it's a general goods store or a grocery store or whatever. Um, and the economy is not doing well, right? People are not buying as much as they were a year ago, which is kind of like what's happening right now. Um, if you work there, how could you be affected by this? Well, you might lose your job, or they might cut your hours, right? Let's say you go from 40 hours a week to 20, right? You go from full time to part time. So you're losing your benefits. You're losing, the amount of money, disposable income that you have to spend on groceries, on gas, on insurance, on rent, on food, whatever. That's what I mean by decline of purchasing power, right? Stores, companies, businesses have to adjust to overproduction and demand changes, the dropping of prices. And so this sets off, again, like another wave of effects, where now your business is being affected by overproduction. So you're trying to deal with that problem by cutting costs, cutting wages, cutting employees, cutting hours. And then those people that you cut now see a reduction in their, um, what did I say? It's called purchasing power, right? So before, let's say you were making $1,000, now you're only making 500. So what does that mean? You have less money for groceries, for gas, for insurance, okay, whatever. So now you have to make your own adjustments, right? So now the people that you do business with, the grocery store, your insurance company, maybe you can't pay your car or your mortgage. Now those businesses are affected by the way that you were affected, right? Because this is like happening exponentially. So now they are going to have to cut wages, cut costs, cut people, right? And it's just, right? It just keeps going and going and going. That's what I mean by overproduction and then decline of purchasing power. These are all issues that the New Deal is going to attempt to deal with. But we'll talk about, how they do that pretty soon. All right. So reason number 4, consumer debt. This is a huge one, right? Because during the 20s, what did we see? We saw the expansion of the businesses, uh, in large part because of the availability of credit. And we saw that, for the average American, their debt increased by 250%, which is huge, all right? And worst of all is that the distribution of wealth had ballooned even more, right? So the top 1% owned 36% of the wealth in the entire United States. And the thing is, like, even though some people got rich and wealthier than they were before during the 20s, most people didn't. For most people, they increased their debt. And, there's only so much that wealthy people can buy. There's only so much money that they can spend. And even though, they still hold a substantial amount of money and wealth, they themselves cannot get the US out of this economic, you know, slump. Um, you need regular folks. You need, people that are going to spend the money, put it back into their communities, put it back into, local businesses and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of a it's kind of a messed up deal, but nevertheless, I mean, we see an increase in the number of people that, or in the amount of wealth that the top 1% have, during the 20s. And for everybody else, all they got was a bunch of more debt because of the advent of credit. Okay. So remember, what is credit? Credit is when you borrow money to buy something that you probably can't afford. I always tell you, this is like your tip, right? If you can't afford to buy it cash, you probably shouldn't buy it. So that's like my pro tip for you. As you start to receive those credit card offers and stuff like that, right? Don't do it. Just and because it's, whatever. I'm not gonna go on this thing about credit and creditors, but it's a bad deal. And you're not getting rich off of it. Somebody else is, right? And so when you're unable to make those payments, right? If I gave every one of you a credit card, right? Here is $1,000 loan that I'm gonna give you. How quickly would you spend it, right? Some of you, would go on Amazon and within a matter of hours it'd be gone. However long it took you, once you reach that limit, once you spend it all, guess what? Now you have to pay it back. and I'm going to make a ton of interest off of it, right? And if you're just making the minimum payment, I hate to break it to you, but you're going to spend, 10 times as much to pay it back than if you would have just spent the $1,000 that you would have saved on whatever it is that you needed to buy. So this is going to be a devastating thing. Remember, because people's debt is increasing by 250% on average. Some is even higher. The economy, the American economy, had been growing, right, like a balloon. But it was unsustainable, right? Because it was built on this credit, this idea of credit. It wasn't that people were making more money or spending more, as they were going into debt. So, we can see a problem down the road here. All right. Anyway, so when that balloon pops, it's going to be a huge thing. So far we have the world economy, right? The instability after World War I as one of the long-term causes. We have the long depression in agriculture, right? Farmers begin to feel uh, the depression as early as 1921, right? Before anybody else does. Overproduction and a decline of purchasing power. So it's not just the farmers that are experiencing this, it's everybody. All of these companies that are seeing overproduction, people are not spending as much. And so they have to make adjustments, meaning that they have to cut costs. And then we see less people, more people with less money to spend. Okay. So that's what decline of purchasing power means. And then the wave that happens after that, right? Other businesses are going to be affected by that too. Consumer debt is a huge problem as well. Even the richest, even the wealthiest, there's only so much that they can spend. It's not enough to get us out of the depression or the crisis that we are starting to see. And then lastly, right, this is one of the biggest factors leading up to the economic collapse. And that's banks and the business weaknesses, right? The lack of monitoring, lack of regulation that took place during the 20s. Remember that during the 20s, we had Republican presidents that were pro-business, business friendly, right? The business of the American people is business, right? That was uh, what the mantra was. And so they cut regulation, they pulled back a lot of the progressive era reforms that were put into place to protect the consumer, to protect the American people, to essentially protect um, customers from business practices that were exploitative or were designed to take advantage of them or designed to increase profits or whatever through shady practices. And so as a result of that, right, they pulled back all of these regulations. And then what happened? Business thrived. Of course it did. But there was a problem, right? There's going to be a price to pay because the banks are unregulated, right? Which means that they can basically do all kinds of questionable loans and business practices. For example, right, if you put your money in the bank, you expect for it to be there when you come back for it a year from now, right? You're saving for a house or you're saving for a car or whatever, right? Um, you expect for that money to be there, right? Now, or you should, that when you put your money in the bank doesn't just hold it for you until you come back, right? They take your money and they do business with it. They loan it, they invest it, whatever, right? If I want to buy a house, if I want to build a pool, I'm going to go to my local bank and go, yes, I'd like a, 10, 15, $20,000 loan for whatever thing. And they go, sure, Mrs. Morris, give us, some background information. Let's see if you qualified. And then they give me the money. Where do you think that money came from? That came from people that put their money in the bank. Now, the bank is uh, um, hoping, right, based on my credit or whatever, based on my history, based on my employment, that I'm a safe investment, right? They're going to give me this money that I'm going to then turn around and give it to a guy that's going to build a pool or give it to some car dealership to buy a car. And so their business is going to do good because of that, right? And then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to pay the bank back for lending me that money plus interest. That's how the banks make money. They take your money that you deposited and they invest it, right? Plus they make money off of fees and all of that. Okay, whatever. That's another topic for another day. But what happens when I don't pay back my loan? What happens if I lose my job and I lose my house? I lose my car. I lose everything, right? The bank's not going to get that money back. And then, whose money was that? That was your money, right? So it's not just the bank that's losing out on that potential profit, right? From the interest of loaning me money, but then your money's gone. And so coincidentally, like it shouldn't matter, right? To you, because you put your money in the bank. You didn't give it to me. You gave it to the bank, and the bank made the decision to give it to me. So they should be responsible for that loss, right? Not you. How cute. That's not the way that it worked. The way that it works is you put the money in the bank, and the bank turns around and does business with it, hoping that it's going to get it back. But then when the whole, shebang hits the ceiling fan, the whole thing just loses control. People's savings were gone. It's like trying to go to the ATM and there's like no money there. I mean, how many times have you gone to an ATM, right? And it's like, oh, this ATM is out of service, right? For whatever reason, maybe they ran out of money, maybe it's, it needs some maintenance, whatever. But imagine going to like every bank in the radio, every IBC, every ATM, and you try and you try and you try to withdraw money. It's not that there's no money in your account, right? Because you got the deposit slips to prove it. It's that the bank doesn't have any more money. And it's not going to give it back. It's gone. This is one of the most difficult things to explain to people, how their money gets lost and how it's never going to come back, right? When the banks fail, the whole economy collapses, right? The economy crashes, the money's gone, the people are not protected. The banking crisis is one of the main reasons for the depression, okay? So don't forget to go into your module section on Canvas. Go in there, go into modules unit 3. We're already in unit 3. Click on the Great Depression and you can follow. This is a quick reminder, right, that there were some major problems with Hoover's presidency. His major problem, of course, was that they didn't do enough. He didn't do enough just simply because he didn't believe that there was anything that the government could do to alleviate some of the the hardships that people were experiencing. He really didn't believe that that's what the government was for, or that there was anything that the president could do, or even Congress, okay? So we did talk about 2 programs in specific that they did go ahead and approve. The first one was a Smoot-Hawley tariff, right? And so that one's right here. And if you remember, that was a tax on imports that was supposed to protect American goods, but it ended up being a complete failure because those countries that we were taxing then turned around and taxed us instead. So, over 20,000 products were taxed, and at the end of this, it actually reduced American exports by at least half. Okay, so they did 50% worse than they would have if they hadn't even tried to intervene. Now, the other program that we talked about was the Emergency Relief and Construction Act in 1932. What this program did was it basically authorized funds, like not public, but
government money, in essence it is public money, for a public works program. But it also created the RFC, which is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, whose goal was supposed to provide government secured loans to financial institutions, railroads, farmers, the people that were really, really struggling, the industries that are really struggling during this time. Now, the RFC really had minimal impact when we look at it, because they were just too conservative. They didn't, dole out the money as aggressive enough to really make a difference. And so it really, it's like too little too late. On the other hand, though, President FDR, he will adopt, the same mentality in having government money, public works program to stimulate the economy, and they will greatly expand on that idea with the New Deal programs, okay? So we talked about Hoovervilles, Hoover flags. I showed you that video on the bonus army. All of this basically sealed, the coffin for Hoover's presidency. And so when FDR comes in, there's just a flurry of legislative activity, right? Those first 100 days in office are going to, there's all kinds of action here trying to address the problems with the Depression. But the other thing that FDR did differently that Hoover didn't was, he reached out to the American people. He had the fireside chats, as well as the First Lady having that column. It was really important for him to let the people know that he cared about what they were going through, and they were trying to address it as best as they could, right? So let's talk about the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. During these first 100 days, there's just unprecedented amount of legislation. You had short-term goals as well as long-term goals in regards to these programs, these New Deal programs. What is it that they are going to address? And so the short-term goals are about relief and immediate recovery. So we're talking about the first and second years that he's in office, right? So it's relief and immediate recovery. And then the long-term goals are about permanent recovery and reform of current abuses. So this is the kind of stuff that, in the long run is, they're trying to address the problems within the banking industry, whatever it may be that contributed to this depression. And so I told you that, these 100 days in office, there's all kinds of different programs that the Brain Trust is coming up with and advising FDR on. Some of them did overlap and got in the way of one another, but this New Deal program moved forward regardless of that. I told you that they're kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, right? Like, let's just see what works to try to address this. Let's see what sticks, in other words. Anyway, so when it comes to relief of suffering, we're talking about suffering of unemployment. So the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, remember it's from 1933 to 1942. Its purpose was to help unmarried, unemployed young men from relief families. So they had to be a part of, relief programs as part of this New Deal. And so the idea behind it was that they would be doing unskilled, manual labor, related to conservation and development of natural resources such as reforestation, firefighting, flood control, those kinds of things. And in exchange for that, they would get $30 a month and food and housing, okay? And out of those $30, $25 went back to their families. So the idea was, to help out those folks that are really, really struggling. So again, ages between 18 to 23. Later on, it will be expanded to 17 to 28. And 3 million of these young men are going to participate in it at its, busiest time. We also talked about the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, also known as the AAA. And what this program did was it created, quote unquote, artificial scarcity. So remember, the problem with the farmers was prices were very, very low as a result of overproduction. And so in order to bring up the prices and to stabilize prices, you have to reduce the amount of supply that is out there. And so the result of this is new crops are going to be plowed over, several million pigs are going to be slaughtered. Some of this food was given to the needy, but the overwhelming majority of it was turned into fertilizer. It was just, destroyed. So it is very, very controversial, especially by the left. And eventually what's going to happen is in 1936, the Supreme Court is going to rule it unconstitutional. And so we're going to have to come up with a new program, which is going to pay subsidies to farmers to plant less, or to let their fields lie fallow, or to plant soil-conserving crops like soybeans, or, with small roots. But anyways, that's what that is. We talked about recovery of the economy, right? The PWA and the NRA. In 1933, they passed this act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which authorized Congress and the President to regulate the industry in an attempt to, stabilize prices, stabilize wages. There's lots of deflation going on here. It's all about stimulating the economy, okay? That's where the Public Works Administration comes in. The PWA is about taking government money and putting people to work, creating jobs, stimulating the economy. And its fundamental thing here is, remember, they are trying to restore purchasing power, right? Having people, allowing them a way to earn a paycheck so that they can go out there in the economy and buy things. And essentially that's what it is. Because remember, people don't just want a paycheck. They want a job. They want to create, be able to contribute. They want to be able to put food on the table. They want to have their sense of dignity restored. And so the PWA is going to put people to work, building dams, bridges, hospitals, schools, all kinds of things, roads, highways, all of that, airports. So its goal here was to spend $3.3 billion in its first year, and $6 billion in total. But they're going to surpass that by a lot. Okay, so anyways, the goal here is to stabilize purchasing power, getting people back to work so that they can, stimulate the economy. So helping lead the economy, all of these, we're addressing the problems with the Depression one at a time, okay? So obviously there's going to be a lot of opposition to this, and one of the works impacts of the New Deal and the New Deal programs is that it's going to change the way that government works, the role, the range, really, I should say. It's definitely expanding the role of the government to make it so that there's lots of different agencies, lots of government spending. But we'll talk about that at the end, okay? What else can we talk about? We said the NRA was another program that was aimed at stabilizing prices and wages, right? It's about getting businesses to work together, basically promising that they're not going to undercut each other or start engaging into these costly price wars. But again, it's controversial because people don't want to be told how much to pay their employees and how much to sell, their products for. So yes, there's a lot of criticism there from all angles about these New Deal programs, especially the NRA. But again, FDR will take it. He'll take it because he's determined to get us out of this hole. Okay? When it comes to reforming the financial system, we talked about the Emergency Banking Act in 1933. What this is going to do is essentially shut down all the banks. As they started to fail, and hundreds of these banks ended up failing, the problem was that people were doing a run on the banks. They were running to the bank and taking their money out. And so if the banks don't have any money, there's no way to operate. And so a lot of them ended up shutting their doors, And so what the Banking Act did was it basically forced these banks to follow these strict guidelines before they are able to reopen their doors, as a way to essentially insure them. So if they want to be insured, they have to have, they have to follow these strict guidelines. And so, of course, here we have the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is essentially going to guarantee you, the customer, that when you put your money in the bank, it's going to be safe. Okay? And so it's up to $250,000 per account. Okay? So like we said, there's lots of opposition to the New Deal. The Supreme Court is going to come in and they're going to judge a lot of these programs unconstitutional. They're going to say that this is an overstep of executive power. And this frustrates FDR very much because, he's trying to do whatever he can. At least this is his perspective, right? He's like, he doesn't understand how the Supreme Court keeps shutting down these programs. He's like, why don't you understand, that we need drastic action? And so he has a proposal here, what we know now as the court packing scheme, where he's essentially proposing that new judges be added for every judge that is over the age of 70 years old. Because one of the criticisms that FDR had was that these judges, who, if you remember, are appointed for life, right? I mean, they're not going anywhere anytime soon. They're old and they're antiquated. They're very old-fashioned, and they're kind of getting in his way, to be honest. And so one of his proposals is to add, younger judges, and of course him being able to appoint them would be appointing liberal or, judges of the same kind of mind. He's going to try to get support for this by, convincing the American people that we need a constitutional amendment to do this. But it's one of those things that, regardless whether you like FDR or not, the American people don't like the idea of messing with the Supreme Court, especially if it's going to give the president too much power, so it's pretty much unchecked. And so the court packing scheme is going to fail. It's not going to go through. The American people don't want it. They don't like it. And so, it's like his worst year as president for sure. Not as popular, but he's forging ahead. Okay. So now let's get to the second New Deal, because the second New Deal, of course, is a response to a lot of those first New Deal programs being struck down. So it's going to follow the same kind of idea, right, that they have to provide some kind of relief or recovery or reforming previous abuses. So here we have the WPA, which is kind of like the PWA, but it's second New Deal. So again, this is about taking government money and employing millions of unemployed people. Mostly unskilled men is what the ones that are carrying out these jobs. Public works projects, including the construction of public buildings and parks, roads. In much smaller but more famous project, the federal project number 1, the WPA employed musicians, artists, conductors, all of these different things. The idea was to take people with specific skills, like, let's say historians, okay, and then hire them to go out and, start working on archiving information, or if you are an actor or, a music teacher, putting on a show for the community, or if you're a painter, that kind of an artist, you would get paid to paint a mural, beautification projects, things like that. And so again, it's kind of like the PWA, but there is about, it also has this artistic flair to it as well. Literacy projects, drama, all of that is also included here. So it's about putting people to work to have a specific talent or a skill set, right? It's not just unskilled labor. It's also, hey, you've got this, put on a show. Let's put you to work. And so, again, it's very successful in terms of, stimulating the economy, getting people, restoring their sense of dignity, all of that, okay? Let's talk super quick about the National Youth Administration. The National Youth Administration, think of it kind of like the CCC, but this time they're not just helping young unmarried men, they're also helping young ladies as well. And so it's focused on providing work for Americans between the ages of 16 and 25, okay? By 1938, it served 327,000 high school and college youths who were paid between $40 a month as work studies, okay? So this is the way it works. Think of it kind of like Job Corps, okay? Where you go to school and you're also getting training, like job training, and they pay you, right? So you're going to school, you're getting an education, you're getting job training, and you're getting paid to do this. At our school here at the college, we have work studies as well that, they're coming to school, and if they qualify, if they get financial aid, they qualify to get a job here on campus, helping us with whatever, right? And sometimes this even prepares them for their career of choice, depending on what their role is here at school. So it's kind of like that. It's kind of like Job Corps. The idea here that the program is about preparing these young men and women for after the New Deal, for when the Depression is over, getting them trained, getting them an education. Yes, it's helping them economically now, but it's about giving them the tools necessary so that when this is all over, they can go out into the community and, be active, productive members of society. Remember that at its core, they're very careful not to create, or they don't want to create, a generation of men and women that are going to be dependent on government help. But that's one of the unintended consequences, right? It's the expansion of the role of government. It's the creation of all of these programs. It's, the expansion of government spending, all of these things. Finally, for today, we're going to talk about reform. Two programs I want to talk about here. The first one is Social Security Act. So this was supposed to act as a safety net, especially for, Americans that were of an older generation, right? Imagine how difficult it must have been to be in the Depression, find it super, super hard to be able to find work, and then even twice as hard because you are, 50, 60, 70 years old. Remember that a lot of these people, if they had savings, if they had money in the bank, their retirements, it was wiped out, it was gone. And so the Social Security Act is a program that kind of acts like a retirement system, right? A retirement program where the beneficiaries are going to get a Social Security check as a payment. And this, of course, is going to help them be able to pay the bills, pay the rent, whatever. So again, this is supposed to act like a safety net. Now, the way that it works is individuals like you and me and companies are going to contribute to this fund. And, all of this money is going to be pulled together. And then once a person reaches a certain age, then they can go ahead and apply to collect that check. Okay? So this first generation of people that are going to qualify for Social Security, they don't have to contribute to it. It's everybody else. It's you, it's me. Throughout our careers, we are contributing to this fund. And hopefully, by the time that we retire, there will still be money there left for us to be able to take care of ourselves, okay? So that's the intent right here, is that the money will be there when we need it. And that's how it was intended to work during the Depression as well, okay? The last program I want to talk about is the National Labor Relations Act and Board, also known as the Wagner Act. Now, in 1935, what this was established to do was to protect the rights of employees and employers by encouraging them to, mediate, like collective bargaining, to curtail a lot of the, privileges that the private sector had. The idea here is to bring together employees and their employers and encourage them to compromise, establish fair wages, benefits, all of that. If this sounds familiar, it should, because in Unit 1 we were talking about how labor and, of course, the businesses always had problems, seeing eye to eye when it came to benefits, when it came to protections, when it came to wages. And so one of the sort of results of the Wagner Act is, the labor unions are going to be very powerful coming out of this time period like never before. And so the idea here is to look out for the general welfare of the workers, to establish safe practices. But, the unintended consequence here is that the unions are going to come out the real winners here. They're going to enjoy a lot of power, unlike what they've seen, in the previous years. Okay, so we're almost done. The question I want you to ponder now is, did the New Deal save the American economy? Okay, because the New Deal, what it did was it established a new tax policy, new wages, new policies for farming, for banking. Essentially, the New Deal is going to affect lots of different sectors in the American economy. We're talking here like massive intervention. Massive intervention on behalf of the government. And, it's just, we've never seen anything like this before. And it's really kind of interesting because, remember, we come from like laissez-faire politics, hands-off government, and then we sort of entered the progressive period where there was an expansion in the role of the government. And then once, World War I broke out, that same sort of rules and model was applied to organize people in industries, for the war effort and all of that. But then after the war, we went back to hands-off government, right? We removed a lot of the protections that were put in place. A lot of the regulation was removed. And then now that we're in the Depression, we're seeing a shift once again, where it's just a huge expansion of the role of the government, a huge expansion on the amount of money that is being spent on all of the safety nets that are being created here. And so this is not what capitalism is. And this is one of the things that FDR is going to get a lot of criticism for. By conservatives, by Republicans. People are going to call him a traitor to his class, because he comes from an upper class family. And the fact that he's got all of these programs and a lot of government spending, it's no wonder that Republicans today are still, fighting the effects of the New Deal. They're still trying to cut government spending. They're still trying to cut welfare programs. And so one of the unintended consequences here is that, this is going to pave the way for the Great Society of the 60s. This is going to change the way that Americans feel about the role of government, about, the expectation. When times are tough, when things are bad, should the government intervene? Should the government come in and protect the American people? And so after the New Deal, for a lot of folks, the answer was yes. The answer was yes. And, like I said, there's still a lot of conservatives out there that, they're trying to conserve, go back to how things were before the New Deal, before the Depression. But here's the thing, right? Let's look at the effects that the New Deal programs had on the American economy, on the American people. Did it get us out of the Depression? No. The short answer is no. Because it's all artificial, right? It's government spending. It's not real. It's unsustainable. But if you look at it from a personal level, right, a micro level, did it help people that worked, with the public works, with the CCC, with the AAA? Did it help them? Did it help them put food on the table? Did it help them, restore their faith in their government, in their country? Absolutely. And that's the bottom line here. Because remember that other countries in the world are experiencing the same kind of hardship. Germany, Italy, Spain, even Britain, a lot of our trading partners. And there's a crisis there as well. Hitler is all too happy to let the people lose faith in the Constitution that he hates. He hates that new German Constitution. Remember that at the end of World War I, he was like, what do you mean the war is over? What do you mean the Kaiser has abdicated? What do you mean we lost? And so it was his goal, to use that Constitution to rise to power, but then use it against the German people. So when the people lose hope, you get things like the communist revolution, right? And the Kaiser abdicating the Tsar and his family abdicated. When the people lose hope in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, it's massive chaos and lots of instability, lots of insecurity, and this makes them susceptible to dictatorships. This is why I told you that with FDR, I'm trying to look for the book. With FDR, I know I have it in here somewhere. With FDR, one of his things that he was very cognizant of was that if he didn't come in and act radically, in a dramatic fashion, he was afraid he might be the last American president. And what that means is things are bad. Look at the footage from the bonus army. Look at those bread lines. Look at the government not doing enough. The people are losing hope. They are calling for change. They are, they want something dramatic. And if they don't do it, if the people lose hope, then that's what FDR means, that he might be the last American president. Who knows what could have happened in the United States? Could the U.S. have been susceptible to a rise in fascism or communism? All of those things are possibilities. And so, did it help us? Did the New Deal programs help the economy? Did it help us out of the Depression? I think in many ways it helped the American people continue to have faith that their government cared, that the system was working, even if it was temporary, even if it was artificial. Because at the end of the day, when World War II starts, it's all of the jobs, all of that spending that actually pulls us out of the Depression. It's the war that gets us out of the Depression, not the New Deal. But the New Deal is temporary. It keeps the people working towards the same goal. It keeps them faithful. It keeps them happy, okay? And not susceptible to dictatorships. So that's why when we see fascism rising in Italy, in Spain, and in Germany, that's why it's such a threat to the United States. Because it is the complete opposite of what we have here, right? For the next lecture, make sure that you watch part 1 of World War I, where you will hear me talk about Germany, Mussolini, and Franco of Spain. Okay? So for now, this is it. We are done with the Great Depression. And so I'll catch you next time I see you. Okay? Bye. Have a good day.